Hello. Welcome to the thousands of viewers who have RSVP'd for the inaugural event for the Coalition for Regenerative Agriculture. We have elected officials, federal agency executives, congressional staffers, embassy personnel, 501c3s, NGOs, and regenerative agriculture activists viewing all over the world, and thank you so much for your support. My name is Dr. Adrienne Gottschalks. I am a soil scientist and mentor for the Soil Food Web School, and I am thrilled to be here with you. I also want to thank you to Now Foods, a great supporter for this event. Now Foods is a respected leader in the natural products industry with a mission to provide value in products and services that empower people to live healthier lives. Thank you for supporting this mission, this event that is in line with their mission. Also, shout out to our friends who have participated or agreed to share this event, the Soil Food Web, the Center for Regenerative Agriculture and Resilient Systems, Regeneration International, Kiss the Ground, Farmers Footprint, Bioneers, and Friends of the Earth. What you're about to hear is the beginning of a paradigm shift. This is a unique opportunity to improve the livelihoods for farmers, increase food security, and stabilize our climate. This paradigm shift is right underneath our feet, or carpet and 13 layers of floor if you're here in this room with us. Today you'll hear from leading experts, including Dr. Elaine Ingham, who's a leader in this idea that soil is not a geochemical substrate, but is alive. And you will also hear from Jeffrey Smith, founder of IRT and the Global Protect Nature Now Coalition. And our first keynote, Dr. Tim LaSalle, co-founder for the Center of Regenerative Agriculture and Resilient Systems, research coordinator for the Howard Buffett African Research Center, and formerly president and CEO of 3 international organizations. Tim will share new cutting-edge data on how the soil, if we allow it to ourselves to consider the soil as alive, soil can act as a climate sponge. It is nonpartisan to support regenerative agriculture for our economy, our climate, and our national security. With that, I'll pass it over to you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Adrienne. It's a pleasure to be here today, particularly with this topic. You know, we find ourselves at a stage in our human existence on this planet of actually threatening life. It's an existential time for us to really consider where we find ourselves with the growing greenhouse gas levels that continue to rise even with many goals set internationally. We know we're moving into another agreement, another conversation between all governments, and we will find that difficult to reduce the amount of emissions that we continue to use in our daily lives with the fossil fuel-based economy. There have been very few ideas around how can we fix that problem. But as Adrienne just mentioned, if we shift our paradigm, our scientific observation, engagement, and our farming practices, what we're seeing is an opportunity actually to begin to be able to draw down our total emissions, or at least negate them at this point. Now, obviously, if you negated it, but you continued your emissions, we'd again be in the same problem we find ourselves in increasing parts per million in the atmosphere of greenhouse gases. So we must reduce. We must absolutely move towards the green energies that we talk about, the renewable energies, away from fossil fuel-based livelihoods. While if this would happen, with the chance literally to transform and use about 70% of our arable farmland, we have found both with farmers now that are actually accruing levels of 10 tons of carbon per hectare, which is really 10 times greater than what most geochemical scientists see and understand in these living soils, then that means it would only take about 70% of our farmland in the world to negate our emissions. That's a pretty fantastic opportunity that lives in reality today. There are farmers in North Dakota, in the name of Gabe Brown, who's been here to Washington, D.C., testifying to his levels of carbon accrual. We are working with a farmer in North Carolina that's gaining 9 tons of carbon per hectare and showing his neighbors the resiliency in that system, the ability to resist droughts, as well as improve soil fertility and improve yields in the crops. We know that Dr. David Johnson in New Mexico has also, over the course of 10 years, done his own trials, and with enhancing, re-establishing that soil biome that Dr. Elaine Ingham will explain to us in more detail later, that there is a boost and the carbon gets drawn down, and those mechanisms will be described later in today's presentations. It's a biological mechanism. It's a natural mechanism, and unfortunately in the last 10,000 years in agriculture, we tried to superimpose our ideas and our control of nature through tillage, which destroys the biological communities, and also later through additives which start to replace and diminish the life of these organisms that can produce the nutrients needed to produce crops. What we're seeing at Chico State University, as we now have 10 major research projects going, trying to absolutely identify and establish and verify these kinds of levels for dissemination in the scientific community and the farming community, is we're seeing similar data points. In a big project in Arizona, we have seen the same level of carbon capture. So this is, as explained, a paradigm change. It means there is a way not just to negate our emissions, but to begin in cooperation with reduced emissions, draw down the excess. You know, one of the things that I think we should really consider is there remains the positing of an idea that 350 parts per million is where we need to be. There is no plan of how to get there. And I would at least ask us to consider we have not tried to exist at that high a level. Civilization was developed on 280 parts per million, and this is a project of regenerative agriculture that could take us even back to that level in this drawdown. Now, what are the benefits that occur when you actually reinvest in your soil through the living system, through the fungi and the bacteria and all the organisms that collaborate with the root of the plant and the plant signals to them, and then the photosynthesis feeds them in that process, and that carbon goes down into the soil? Here's the co-benefits that start to arise. We end up getting more fertile soil, needing less and less inputs, saving the farmer money, actually giving the farmer, he or she, a much better opportunity to make a living, no matter whether they are a small farmer in Africa or a 10,000-acre farmer in the Midwest. The next co-benefit that occurs is we get not just with increased fertility in that soil and ability to produce the nutrients the plant needs, we get the opportunity to see a soil that can actually percolate water at a much faster rate because the soil structure is changed by this biological phenomena. In essence, farmers have reported to us when they begin the process of regeneration, they would get about 1/4 of an inch percolation per hour in rainfall because of the way we farmed. It compacted it. Now they get 11 inches per hour. How many floods would that begin to mitigate simply because the land could take the water in and not run off the top? The next part to that is as you build soil carbon, then you begin to create more water holding capacity. And what I've seen in Africa and what we're working with this farmer in North Carolina has seen with dramatic results is an opportunity to resist droughts. He got 4 inches of rain in 1 year in North Carolina in 2015. His neighbors were able to harvest 9 bushels of corn. He harvested 125. Same land, same practices in the seeding, but he had a regenerative approach and built the soil health with the biology. And there's the difference of food security, food for the people, versus, in essence, potential starvation. The other co-benefits is that we begin to, reducing the inputs on farms, greatly reduce any of the runoffs that pollute our rivers and waterways. Today, the globe is facing 400 dead zones, mostly based on agricultural runoff of excess nitrogen and phosphorus that come in the supplementation to the soil because it's not healthy. It's a broken, dysfunctional soil, not a healthy, living, functional soil. So these co-benefits begin to at least demand for us to reconsider our paradigm and our science and our study and our experiments and our trials and our support of farmers to move towards a regenerative living soil system. There is another benefit for absolutely everyone beyond the climate and the cleaner water approach, and that has to do with the nutrient density in the plants. We are finding that the food is definitely healthier. This same farmer in North Carolina kind of bet somebody that his corn would be heavier than his neighbor's. And his neighbor's was 33 pounds a bushel, his was 44. Same amount, different weight, more nutrients, all created by the biology in the soil. What happens in our American diet and around the world is that we're knowing that we are in a place of nutrient deficiency because the nutrient levels of our foods have diminished 50% in many foods since World War II. This is an opportunity to restore our health through healthier foods as well. So in quick summary, let me just say, regenerative agriculture is one of the most exciting things I could dedicate my life to. I know it's going to affect issues of hunger around the world. It's going to definitely affect climate in such a positive way. It will help farmers improve their profit. It will improve the health of our waterways and the food we eat. Thank you for coming today, and we look forward to further conversations.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Tim LaSalle. And now I would also love to invite Dr. Elaine Ingham to join us up here on the stage. Dr. Elaine Ingham has the entire alphabet soup of credentials. You can ask her about all of them. It led her to being a research professor at Oregon State University, later starting the Soil Food Web Incorporated. Suppose I can take this off while I'm talking. Soil Food Web Incorporated, which worked with farmers around the world, and has more recently started the Soil Food Web School, where we have students internationally learning how to implement soil biology techniques to fix their soil and get it active and healthy. And so now it is my honor to get to ask our panel some questions. So now, Tim, Elaine, how is this possible? Let's talk about profit and the economics. What exactly does a farmer who converts to regenerative agriculture, what exactly do they experience on an economic scale?
So typically, or do I need to stand?
Nope, you're good.
Yeah, Mike's right here. So typically when we work with growers, we go out and we assess their soil, determine what's going on in that soil, and then we are going to add back the microorganisms that they're lacking in that soil. So it's not a very expensive process. As soon as we get the organisms growing in that soil, we find that nutrient cycling picks up very rapidly, and you basically end up not needing any synthetic fertilizers at all. So imagine what that prevents the grower having to put food out there. So some success stories in the Hudson River Valley, not that far from here, up in New York State. We have a person who's been working in about 3,000 acres up in that part of the world, and they reduced the synthetic nitrogen fertilizers from 200 units down to 50 units in each acre. How much money is that person saving and keeping in their pocket? And yet, they had the same yields and better quality grass for their animals to be feeding on. Look at bananas in Ecuador, and we've been doing a fair amount of work in South America. And in this particular instance, $1,000 per hectare was saved over 200 hectares, and the yields were also increased at about $500 per hectare. And so that's a $300,000 increase per year for those growers.
I love these stories and examples. Dr. Elaine, one time you told me about a dairy farmer who was able to increase their weight gain in their cattle by 25% because they grew more grass than they were ever able to bale before, and their grass had 2% more protein in each of the blades. Now, Tim, how much do these examples scale up? A lot of our farming industry takes place in a cornfield, a soybean field. Will you talk to me a little bit about that?
Well, in the economics of some of the principal crops that are grown in this country and in grains around the world, which still ends up being as one of the main energy sources, sometimes those are grown on large scale. And what we find, because part of the regenerative processes kind of demand a no-till or a minimum tillage situation, we begin to save farmers a lot of money with regard to tractor and fuel use and depreciation and maintenance on tractors. The second part to that is we're looking to help reinvigorate the soil, as Elaine just mentioned, with the living biology that has been either extincted or in essence diminished. We can apply those in the same methodologies that happen with the old systems of fertilizing. What this has provided is farmers an opportunity to create a lot more profit for themselves. And when they reduce those input costs, it's like Gabe Brown in North Dakota says, as he became a regenerative farmer year after year, he learned he could do with less inputs, biology got healthier. As he said, I really loved at the point in my life when I was no longer signing the front of the check, because I prefer to sign the back of the check. And that's the opportunity that farmers will gain from it. We show in some economic analysis in a study we're doing in Arizona that a farmer can increase his net margins on corn and also on pinto beans by an average of about $150 an acre when you move away from the high cost inputs to the biological regenerative system.
And Elaine, what other techniques have you noticed farmers are using in order to save themselves? How else do they save money by switching to regenerative agriculture?
Typically, we can reduce rotations so that we can stay in the cash crop with our growers year after year after year. An example is ZZ2, which is a very well-known tomato producing company in South Africa, up around Limpopo. And when they invited me to come out and take a look at their land, because they wanted to know how could they possibly keep farming if they had to have their cropland out of production for 14 years. And then they could raise 1 year's worth of tomatoes. And if they planted again in the year following, their tomatoes were just completely destroyed by disease-causing fungi and by root-feeding nematodes. Closer to the mic. So we started working with them on getting the right sets of microorganisms back into the soil so that they could put back in all these activities that the microorganisms are well known to do. So we reduced their number of years they had to be out of production in their fields down to 0. They grow tomatoes in the same fields year after year after year after year, and there is no loss in productivity, no loss in yields, and their flavor in their tomatoes have won recognition throughout Africa up into the European markets. So people going into stores, going into restaurants will actually require that they get ZZ2 tomatoes on their salads, or they won't order the salad because the taste is that different. So what's the nutrition as well? So if your tomatoes, if your produce tastes so much better, that's your body recognizing the nutrients in that plant material. So where do you want to be buying your tomatoes from? ZZ2 or from a chemical company?
I've also heard that a lot of the regeneratively produced produce extends their shelf life, right? The peppers that went from expiring in a week or less we're able to last totally intact, healthy peppers on the shelf for 4 weeks, which totally changes the game for food security.
And we've seen the same thing with the tomatoes from ZZ2. When you have to transport from South Africa all the way up to Amsterdam, you usually lose quite a bit of your tomato production that way. The diseases inside the cardboard carriers are perfect breeding grounds for diseases and problems. And yet, when these tomatoes are shipped off to Europe, you don't have the degree of disease and pest because the outside of that tomato is covered with really beneficial microorganisms. We make sure they're in the soil. We make certain that that material gets spread up onto the...
Oh, no, with the mic, you're having some trouble hearing on the podcast.
Okay.
There we go.
So, where was I? So, all of the organisms on the surface of those tomatoes are exactly what your digestive system needs in addition. So think of your gut microbiome. You are putting back into your own body the microorganisms that, well, if you've been ingesting toxic chemicals, you've lost that microbiome. So we get those organisms back into their systems, into the humans and the animals that are eating that material.
Thanks, Elaine. Now, Tim, I'm not sure if anyone noticed as he was talking with his hands, but Tim is also a farmer and has been harvesting his walnuts. And so I hear you have a story for us about walnuts.
When we're talking about regenerative agriculture, and yes, I'm not a large walnut farmer because I'm picking mine up by hand. I have 6 mature trees, and it's quite a few walnuts, but this is natural walnut stain, let me just say that. But in fact, a walnut farmer in Northern California began regeneratively producing his walnuts, which meant he started to pull his inputs. And the average input cost for the walnut farmer in Northern California is about $2,800 an acre. And that's the cost of production. His cost of production, when he planted cover crops, he began to be able to eliminate most all of his input costs, from insecticides to fertilizers, and his costs were $800 an acre. And therefore, the margin that he created for himself was $2,000 an acre difference. He didn't quite meet their yield, but it was close enough. He was just about 3% lower, and what he ends up with is a huge, or shall we say maybe he made money that year and his neighbors did not. It has caused other neighbors to follow his suit because they're realizing in the struggles of prices and markets for farmers, they need every advantage they can get. And the soil biology, as Dr. Ingham and we have talked about with you today, is one of the biggest levers to be able to move forward for your own sustainability on your farm.
Oh, Tim, in addition to the input cost and the machinery cost and potentially continuously farming the crop, what about water? How can farmers save using water?
So we did talk a little bit about water holding capacity with regard to building the soil health and building the soil carbon stores. So that's all carbon that came from the atmosphere and goes into the soil. That becomes a sponge. It holds up to 30,000 gallons more water per acre for every 1% of soil organic matter increase. And we've seen huge increases in farms from 0.5% up 6% of soil organic matter. So it is a great opportunity to store and hold water, which means you're going to need to, in the area I come from, California, pump less or purchase less water. That's an important element, but it's very important in areas where it's rain-fed and that you have no control over water inputs, and that if there's short years, it's really an important aspect. One example that I think Adrian's sort of alluding to here is in our research project in Arizona, in the pinto bean production, where they had to pump water from so deep. The economic difference is they were losing money on the pinto beans. In the regenerative system, because the yield jumped and the input costs were reduced so dramatically, even with the high cost of pumping, they were able to make a profit, and farming could continue there, which means photosynthesis would continue there, which means more opportunity to take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere.
Thank you. And I'm sorry to keep coming at you, but I also know that you worked in Africa for 4 years. And that's a very different climate. And when we're thinking about water and water costs, that's a totally different game in Africa and around the world. What's your experience globally with regenerative agriculture?
So Howard Buffett had invited me to run some trials there. He knew that no-till was really crucial. That was a piece of agriculture that I needed to learn more about because in conventional systems or organic systems, tillage is often used. Secondarily is that he knew that artificial fertilizers were not going to be an opportunity for the whole of Africa because of the cost. It was unsustainable. And thirdly, as you add those fertilizers, you end up destroying the organic matter in the soil, becoming less productive. So in my experimentation, I was given, as Howard said, I'm going to give you some of the best, worst soil you can farm on, which he did. It was phosphorus short, it was sandy, it had almost no organic matter. And after the first year, with no outside inputs, basically in feeding this biology, I ended up with no phosphorus deficiencies in the plants. And we'll come back to what Elaine will explain to us later of what the fungal communities can do on demineralization. So what happens is nutrients can be cycled, they can be liberated, they can be manufactured for the plant. My yields soon increased over 5 times, which would take a smallholder farmer who was barely getting a ton of maize per hectare, they could move to 5 tons, which then meant for them and their families not only food security, it meant money for school fees. It meant a future for their children.
And I do know often it is the women who do not get to go to school when when times are hard. So this also has implications for educating the girls in those communities. Now, Elaine, you have also worked around the world. And I know that you have collaborated with farmers around the world, and you've seen those economic gains on the farm scale to an amazing degree, an amazing number of examples that we can talk more about later. But what about a national scale? What about a state scale? What could this mean?
Well, it means that most of the people in a certain area are, if they're utilizing these techniques, these toolboxes that we're selling people basically, in how to get the biology back into your soil and promote it, get it to continue to give the benefits, and in a bit I'll go over a list of all of the benefits and explain why they do function. So, if we can reduce the national food security, that just means for everybody living in this country or any other country on the planet, they don't have to be dealing with starvation.
Absolutely. And it sounds like through your work with other governments as well, that you have made some progress. And Tim, what's your experience in working with other governments, or what this could mean for states and nations?
Government policies are a challenge often to help move from entrenched habits or histories. And in essence, we have seen some movement in a province in India, Andhra Pradesh. They have actually committed to what is an inoculation, a regenerative approach to farming with multi-species cropping. They have actually moved 3 million farmers to a regenerative agriculture approach that has been able to create a difference of getting 1 crop a season, a year, actually a year, to 3 crops. Same amount of rain, same soils, a different approach that brings life to the soil.
It's incredible. I also know an organization called Tieni is able to give a farmer an extra meal every day through regenerative practices. And it's just incredible. One question I would love to throw at both of you is, what has personally convinced you that this can work?
Lots of places all around the world that we've been going out and assessing the biology in their soil using a microscope. And I can teach any one of you in this room today how to use that microscope in a day. It's not that complicated, it's not that expensive, and you could start seeing whether you have these organisms in the soil. Do you have the good guys or you have the bad guys? I know that sounds rather simple as a comparison, but we know what the conditions are that will build that beneficial set of organisms, the soil food web in the soil. So, teaching everybody, that's my goal in life, is to make sure everyone on this planet has their own microscope and you use it every day.
And this is why I'm so grateful to work for you, because I love working with students around the world to do this. Tim, what has convinced you specifically?
I choose not to live my life behind a microscope, unlike these two delightful women. But in essence, I have seen it on farms. I have experienced it in farming. What I find daily almost unfathomable is the levels of carbon we are capturing. And we at Chico State right now are trying to pull together a rather large project across 4 states, comparing regenerative to conventional. We want to do flux tower measurements. We want to do methane nitrous oxide measurements, as well as looking with soil probes, new technology that's coming out based against soil core samples. So we can actually have a widespread, broad-based, whole system research that can begin to really push against the old paradigm and show the opportunity of what this new paradigm seems to be revealing itself to us. What Elaine Ingham's been working on her whole lifetime is such a new paradigm in the scientific world and the farming world. What we're discovering now is it actually is very functional, and it's the way we should have been doing it all along. Let's return to what nature perfected. Let's support nature, and we are getting the scientific understanding of how to do that.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. Do you have anything else you'd like to add at this moment? Otherwise, I'm excited to now finally give you the moment. You've now heard why we're excited about this. You've heard what we're excited about, but now Dr. Elaine Ingham is going to explain a bit more about how this works. How do we think about all of the ways of growing plants that we've always thought about in that geophysical, geochemical paradigm, fertilizers, pesticides, like irrigation. What does that look like from a regenerative perspective? Dr. Elaine Ingham, the podium is yours.
Okay, now we get into the good stuff. I have spent my whole entire academic career working on the life in the soil, the sets of organisms that need to be present. Now, I want to keep this, not getting too down and dirty into the gory details of what exactly goes on in the soil, but one of the things that have been spoken about today in this paradigm shift that we're talking about is that inorganic fertilizers really aren't needed. If you want to get the biology out and still put on inorganic fertilizers, okay, but you're killing things. You're killing the beneficial organisms in your soil when you use an inorganic fertilizer. But, some people just can't let go of the safety blanket, and they are going to put a little bit out in the first year, maybe 50% of what they would have used normally. And like that one grower I was talking about in the Hudson River Valley, where he was still putting out a small 50 units of nitrogen synthetic fertilizer out, but he had reduced it by 200. So that a huge reduction in the next year he didn't use that inorganic fertilizer. So how is it that we can do this? So if you look at healthy soil, one of the things you probably need to understand is that there is no soil that lacks the nutrients to grow plants. They're there. You have maybe 10, 20, 30 years worth of those nutrients present in your soil. Notice I did not say dirt. I'm talking soil. We have the nutrients present in that soil. So what's the difference between soil and dirt? Well, dirt contains sand, silt, and clays, the mineral fraction of the soil. We're talking about soil, where we have to have organic matter in order to feed the microorganisms. And then we have to have the right sets of beneficial organisms present to be able to do the job of converting those not plant available nutrients into plant available nutrients. So we've got to have the plant making foods to grow those bacteria and fungi, put the enzymes together, pull the nutrients, and now your plant is going to be able to get the nutrients that it requires. When we talk about keeping nutrients in the soil, that is the job of the bacteria and fungi once again. And so we have to have those organisms present in the soil in order to retain those nutrients, prevent erosion, not have nutrients leaching out of your soil. So you don't want any more loss of your soil. You need biology. Pesticides, another factor that is strongly influenced by getting these organisms back into the soil. We want to make certain that the plant has all the nutrition it requires. Well, just like you need all the nutrition that's possible. And why is that? Well, because if you're stressed by a lack of nutrition, you're going to get sick. You don't have the immune system. So both plants and animals require this kind of improvement in nutrients so that the pests, the diseases, the problem organisms aren't going to be able to cause the problem. We want to make certain that all the above ground part of the plant is covered with these beneficial organisms as well, so you don't have loss of your above ground yields. We want to build good water structures. Most people don't understand that it is the microorganisms that make the glues to hold your sand, your silt, your clay particles together and form micro and macro aggregates. We want to make certain that we can get oxygen down into the soil. Well, how are you going to do that if you've been driving back and forth with big equipment, compacting and compressing every time you till? You compact and press your soil down. Well, you can't get oxygen down to your root systems. All of our terrestrial plants are obligate aerobes when it comes to the root system. And if we're not allowing air passageways and hallways to be built, to be maintained, then your roots are only going to go down a few inches and then go sideways. How can you make a high yield if the only soil your plant can get anything from is just a couple of inches at the surface of the soil? I like to talk a little bit or go off on a tangent just a little bit because this story is just too much fun. I've worked with a lot of people up in the Boston area with the Boston tree guys. And when we were first starting to work in that part of the world, Peter wanted his lawn to be treated with the proper sets of microorganisms to be able to give him all of the inorganic fertilizers, no need for the pesticides, building soil structure, ways for oxygen and water in your roots to get as deep as possible. And so in the beginning of the summer, everybody's lawns looked just fine, looked just great, but as the summer continued, a drought set in. And so by the first week of September, everybody else's lawns looked horrific. No green growing grass, nothing like that. The only thing green in their yards were the weeds. And that's not really going to be impressing your neighbors at all, is it? So Peter said that they invoked water restrictions, so they could not water their lawns except for maybe every 5th day, something along that lines. And so all of the neighbors' lawns just had to stay brown. Peter's lawn was beautiful, green, nothing brown, nothing dying. His trees, his bushes, his shrubs, no diseases, no pests, no problems. And because there was a fine associated with watering your lawn, the police knew that he had to be watering his lawn. So he said every night he would get up, look out the window, and there would be the black and white out there waiting for his irrigation system to go on. And it never did because he had no need. So we see these kinds of interactions all the time by getting the proper biology back into the soil. Weeds, I think we've discussed weeds a little bit. Weeds require the right set of organisms in the soil. And we teach people all about what that set of nutrients are that have to be present in the right concentrations. What's the balance of fungi and bacteria in order that the weed seeds won't germinate and they don't grow? The sick, unhappy, unhealthy plant in those systems are the weeds. So yet another benefit of getting these organisms back into the soil. If you have toxins left over from the last person who lost your who lived on your property, after you bought it, you discovered they put out a lot of toxic chemicals, especially pesticides, herbicides, things like that. How do you get rid of them? All you have to do is get the sets of microorganisms back into the soil, and they very happily decompose those materials for you. We want to deal with carbon sequestration, and we know that when we get into the soil and understand that process of sequestration, it's all about life in the soil. Who sequesters most of the carbon in the soil? So hopefully I've been able to give you a pretty good idea of how the biology in the soil is going to be helping your plants grow. We've talked about some really strong examples of the work going on. We have a lot on our website, soilfoodweb.com. We have a lot more examples of places where we've been able to save money, save damage to the soil, improve nutrition, all those good things.
Don't run away yet.
Not yet, I have to.
So, before Dr. Elaine Ingham runs away, she has a remarkable story for us that is, I think, illustrates the carbon capture in an entirely different way. So, with that, let's hear more about how deep in the soil roots can really grow, because the root itself is pulling down the carbon. The root is carbon. The root's made of carbon, but not only that, but when a plant is photosynthesizing, across all plants, an average of 40% of those sugars that the plant is making, in all of those leaves, plants work really hard for that. All of those sugars, 40% of them are being sent into the roots and down out of the roots. It's not a waste, it's not a loss. It's useful, it's getting those microorganisms. But that's a lot of carbon. That's a liquid sugar drip feeder for microorganisms. So let's hear how deep that really is.
So, roots, how far down can they grow? Well, I gave you a hint just previously that it's got to be an aerobic environment because roots are obligately aerobic, terrestrial plants. Now, go to a wetlands, all of those plants, all of those photosynthetic organisms have to have ways to deal with anaerobic conditions. But terrestrial systems are not supposed to be anaerobic at any time. The bad guys are typically the things that are going to be alive and working under anaerobic conditions. So if we want our root systems to grow very deep into the soil, we need to make certain that the airways and passageways are maintained. So for example, some work that I did with Hendrika Schraven, who is one of the most amazing landscape architects you'll ever meet in your whole life. His landscapes are just incredible, luscious, gorgeous, and he and I have shared the desire to understand biology in our soil. So we did an experiment to try to show people how far down the roots of their grasses can grow. So think about that right now. How deep do the roots of your grasses go in your lawn? So most people think of the roots of the grass maybe go down maximum 3 inches, if you're really lucky 4. But when we did this experiment, this demonstration, if you will, we had an area where the soil was compacted. We did nothing to improve it. We tilled and then put the grass seed out. On the other part of the property, we applied the right biology. The area was compacted, but could we get these organisms, by adding these organisms into the soil, could we get them to rebuild the soil structure and start getting oxygen down deeper and deeper? How far will those roots go down? So at the end of the growing season, what we did was take some big PVC pipes and pound them into the soil, and then had to pull those out. When we looked at, and then we took a saw and sawed off the PVC pipe, so you had a nice core of that soil. And you could see that the root systems on the conventional side, the tilled side, well, and tillage is supposed to break up all of the compaction, right? Well, down to how deep the plowshare went. So those roots went down about 6 inches and then went sideways. So all of the grass in that area is competing with each other. There's not a prayer. I can see that sign. Something was written on it. I can't tell what. So, sorry. Looking at the other side, then where we had put the biology into the system, when we took the saw, removed the outside layer, the root systems on those grasses were down 4.5 feet. And that's just in one growing season. Every year, grasses should be putting their root systems deeper and deeper and deeper. So we easily find root systems 25 feet deep. If you have good structure in your soil and you've gotten the good rainfall or snowfall and you've gotten all those pores filled with water, then if your root systems go down deep, you don't have to irrigate. You should not have to be watering your lawn in the middle of a dry winter or summer, sorry. So I could go on.
That was brilliant. Thank you, Dr. Ingham. And now, Dr. Ingham, you get to stay. Please join us. And I'm also going to invite Jeffrey Smith, who is the founder of IRT and the Protect Nature Now Coalition. He's also an award-winning documentary filmmaker and international best-selling author. Welcome, Jeffrey.
Thank you. We're going to talk about protecting the little guys. We've heard, I think by now, that the microbes do the heavy lifting. We can talk about stabilizing the climate, improving yields, creating food security, reducing toxins, cleaning up dead zones, increasing farmers' profits. But who, Elaine, is doing all that work?
It's all my critters. All my critters in the soil.
Yeah, see, Elaine is a microbe whisperer. You've heard of horse whisperers? Well, you know, a lot of what we know in the world of regenerative agriculture is because of Elaine's work. She understands the relationships between the microbes and how that relationship takes the biology and moves it through very specific, predictable stages. So it's like having a doctor that knows exactly what's going on, what the treatment is, and how to move using, in the case of the doctor, the intelligence of the body, in the case of Elaine, nature's intelligence in the soil to move it forward. Now, that raises the question, Elaine, of the means by which we can ensure that the benefits of regenerative agriculture are available in this and future generations. We all know that wide-scale spreading of antibiotic, microbe-killing chemistry can suppress these communities, but there's new technology that can have an even longer-term impact. And that is changing the genetic structure of the microbes in such a way that they reproduce and pass that on and pass that on and pass that on with potentially irreversible side effects. And so we have created the Protect Nature Now Coalition. Right now there's more than 50 organizations around the world. That number is growing. It's a new coalition. And we are seeking ways to protect the soil microbes, the gut microbes, in fact, the microbiome in all ecosystems from the potentially dangerous and unpredictable effects of outdoor released genetically engineered microbes. Now, I'm going to be sharing some of the science that shows why this is a high risk. But Elaine, you were involved in something in Oregon some years ago, and I've interviewed you for my last film, which is called Don't Let the Gene Out of the Bottle. And it's at protectnaturenow.com. It's free. It's a short film, 16 minutes. But I'm going to do a plot spoiler here, right? So you're going to know a little bit about the film already. This was something you've discussed at the UN and around the world. You just happened to be at we can say the right place at the right time or the wrong place at the right time, where genetically very well-intentioned scientists had a brilliant idea to help farmers and farming through genetically engineered microbes. And instead of burning the crop residues after harvest, which doesn't do good for anyone, as you told me, they rake them up, put them in a barrel, add this genetically engineered microbe, which after 2 weeks turns into alcohol, which can run the tractor, sell off farm for additional money, and take the nutrient-rich sludge on the bottom and spread it on the fields. But you had a graduate student who decided to just happen to be your graduate student that was doing research and wanted to do something on genetically engineered microbes and had a chance to take a look at what the impact was of these microbes in soil that he had planted with wheat seeds. So can you tell us what happened and why this was a shot that was not heard around the world, but probably should have been?
Yep, so this was a bacterium, Klebsiella planticola, who had been genetically engineered to produce alcohol. And so my graduate student, Michael Holmes, wanted to use a soil organism instead of like the other choices were for him to choose E. coli. Well, E. coli doesn't survive in the soil. That's not reasonable. So he chose Klebsiella planticola to be what he would follow, what he would look at. And so in the treatments, basically he was comparing the no Klebsiella planticola added into the wheat seedling or into that soil. The second treatment was where he had put the parent Klebsiella planticola to find out what the parent would do to those weed seedlings. We expected very beneficial things. And then the genetically engineered Klebsiella planticola into the third set of containers. And then compared, kept watching through the course of the experiment, so about 7 days after he started this, he came to the laboratory early in the morning because he was going to go out rock climbing later in the day, so he just thought he would come in and get all of his little seedlings watered. And all of a sudden I get a phone call like at 6 a.m. in the morning on a Saturday, thank you. And he's practically hysterical on the other end of the phone because a whole bunch of his little seedlings are dead. Oh no, he's going to have to start it all over again. He has to finish up. He got a job already. He just, and I had to calm him down and say, just start taking the containers out of the growth chamber and look at if there's any effect on the, based on the Klebsiella planticola engineered or not engineered. So in the treatment that had just water added, and little baby seedlings in there, they had grown quite nicely. Where we had the parent Klebsiella planticola, the plants were trying to grow out of the top of the container. So what's your conclusion about the Klebsiella planticola, the parent? It is beneficial. Look at how much it increased the growth of those plants in a short 7 days. Now, all of the plants on the Klebsiella planticola engineered to produce alcohol had turned into green slime on the surface of the soil. How would you like to interpret that? Is this genetically engineered organism of greater risk than the parent? What if that bacterium got free? It got out into the real world and it started spreading. What's the logical possibility? Think about this one. I'm not going to answer it for you. What's the possibility that that could have catastrophic effects?
This was an example of well-meaning scientists with a great idea on paper. The bacterium that they had genetically engineered had passed all the tests needed for release. It had passed all the EPA tests. 2 weeks after Michael walked into the laboratory and found that he had slimed his experimental batch, 2 weeks after was the date that they were going to release this outdoors. Now, we did not need a pandemic to know that microbes can travel around the world. And we now know that Klebsiella planticola is on the root structures of all plants that they've tested. The big questions are, would it be possible that a runaway version of the genetically engineered variety could out-survive the natural counterpart? Is Klebsiella planticola in its natural form killable by alcohol?
You have to have a high concentration of the alcohol to kill the parent. And what we saw, what Michael saw in his experiment, was that the genetically engineered treatment had a higher number of Klebsiella planticola engineered to produce alcohol as compared to the parent Klebsiella planticola.
So that little piece of data that the genetically engineered variety had a proliferative effect raises the specter or the question, if it did get out and it did spread, would it have displaced its natural counterpart, killing it off and replacing it, and then turning root structures in various fields into alcohol? So that's a catastrophe averted, potentially, or even a cataclysm averted. And that's where, in this case, it's a microbe that was genetically engineered to do something very specific that just did it so well that it could have been a disaster for the ecosystems. But there are other ways that genetically engineered microbes can create unpredictable and potentially dangerous outcomes that are irreversible. First of all, the technique itself. I've been involved in speaking to dozens and dozens of scientists and experts around the world for 25 years, and they have concluded, and as I have, that the most common result of genetic engineering is surprise side effects. There's significant damage and changes in the genome that cannot be predicted in advance. And so when you genetically engineer a microbe, there's the possibility that it's doing something that you didn't intend. But even if it is exactly what you wanted, once you release it, and we didn't need a pandemic for this, it can mutate. We know about mutations. So we create something with one outcome, it mutates, and now it's doing something different. Now, we also know that microbes travel to different ecosystems, including inside the gut. So we release it for a field for the benefit of a particular farmer, and it ends up in the gut of an infant or on the other side of the world, or in the atmosphere, or in Siberia, or under the water. And not just the same species, but bacteria have something that we don't do. They have these big swap meets where they take their genetic material, like baseball cards, or to be more modern, Dungeon and Dragon cards, or maybe I'm still showing my age, and they swap their genes. And they can swap their genes into many different types of microbes, not just their own species. So now if you create a genetically engineered change in a microbe and you put it out there, pretend that there's no side effects from genetic engineering or gene editing, pretend that there's no mutations, pretend that that particular thing doesn't travel, but it goes to a swap meet, and now all of its friends are carrying it to all sorts of ecosystems. Now, what is the result of this genetically engineered change that did not evolve naturally for billions of years? What is the predictability of its impact on the microbiome? Elaine, how much do we know, or more importantly, how much do we not know about the microbiome?
Well, I remember when I was a graduate student, we had a book called Bergey's Manual that listed all the known species of bacteria to man. And there's a little bit under 5,000 species listed in Bergey's Manual. Today, when we go out and we start looking for the amount of DNA differences, how many different species of bacteria are being suggested? We're probably at 1 billion. There are 1 billion different species of bacteria on this planet, and maybe more than that, because work being done at the Macaulay Institute in Aberdeen, in Scotland, at the University of Aberdeen, they're showing that there are active living bacteria and fungi in molten lava. How many bacteria are that we've never even suspected were there? So we know practically nothing about all the different species of bacteria or fungi or protozoa or nematodes, or can I just keep going?
So now we have an unpredictable input into a system that we don't understand. But as we begin to learn more about the microbiome, scientists and doctors around the world are kind of in awe. I speak to some of the world's leading experts in the microbiome, and I have learned, for example, that in breast milk, in human breast milk, a significant portion of it is entirely undigestible by the baby. It's not designed for the baby. It's designed to feed the microbiome. And when the baby has certain medical needs or nutritional needs, it's reflected in the microbiome of that baby's saliva, which then gets communicated through the breast to the mother's physiology and changes the formula in a custom drink to keep that baby's microbes healthy. When there's a breast tumor, bacteria rush to the breast to protect us. I've been told by one leading doctor that when the microbiome of the brain is reduced, the IQ goes down. One of the chief experts in gut microbiome said, we actually outsource 90% of our daily metabolic functions to the microbiome, and we can get away with a paltry 22,000 genes in our cell because we use the genetic information from 3.5 million in the microbiome living inside us. Now, how is this all possible? It's because there was a coevolution. Milk digesting bacteria migrate to the birth canal in the second trimester so they can inoculate the baby so that they can digest milk. This is part of a system that people are in awe about. And we're realizing that there's a programming and an intelligence and a micro Jedi army working on our behalf in the body, in the soil, even in the atmosphere. If you look at Protect Nature now and you go to the movie, you can see a microbe that hangs out in the atmosphere and helps create rain. And there was a genetically engineered version that could have theoretically altered weather patterns. So what we are looking to do is protect the microbiome by disallowing the release of genetically engineered microbes, which by their very nature can potentially create unpredictable impacts, and by the nature of nature, be unrecallable. And so I wanted to offer it as kind of an insurance policy for regenerative agriculture. Because if we mess up the microbes, then all of the benefits that you've talked about are at risk. So I see myself water skiing on the back of regenerative agriculture with an insurance policy, saying, yes, all of those things that you're talking about, all those microbes that you talk to on a regular basis, that you've identified their relationships and their communities and their cliques and their niches, we want to protect them. We want to protect the little guys. And because of the science and because of the 50,000 studies just in the human microbiome in the last 5 years, because of the burgeoning science now, wherever I go and talk about this, there is a great sense of urgency that this needs to be locked down immediately in order for the nature of nature to continue without us messing it up. And as you've talked out today, and as Tim's talked today, the nature of nature is what regenerative agriculture relies on. That's really where your expertise is, to figure out that intelligence. And so I'd like to sell you an insurance policy. Thank you.
Sign me up.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey and Elaine.
Do I get to?
You get to go. Thank you. As part of this transition from geochemical to alive to biology, I like the idea of using our understanding of the gut microbiome as we as humans do everything to, wow, we get to collaborate with multitudes of microorganisms, and that paradigm shift has already been happening in our own health, and now let's let it happen for the soil. So we've all been so excited in the back as we're listening to one another that we decided to add an additional segment into this conversation. And that is that in order to help jumpstart and get us all into regenerative agriculture, let's talk about what gets in the way head on. So I'm going to invite Dr. Tim LaSalle back up here to tell us about the barriers to adopting regenerative agriculture practices. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrienne. You know, with all of the information we've received today with regarding the benefits and the profit, both to the environment and to the farmer, we wonder why isn't it just adopted yet? And I think the barriers to entry, the barriers to adoption are important. Well, we kind of start with many of us that have kind of worked in the area of education or training. We understand adoption theory. And you know an adoption theory where you get the innovators, the ones that risk and try. And those are the Russell Hedricks in North Carolina and the Gabe Browns in North Dakota that really saw, observed, and tried this new approach. They studied everything they could and they figured out systems all on their own that really worked very well. But we know that's less than 10% of the population. If we even think about our own personalities, we go to the next kind of 20%, we have the early adopters that will watch those kind of people and then begin to mimic or adopt what they're doing. It takes the laggards a lot longer to really begin to include it. They have a lot of habits that they're not really ready to shift on. And then we have the bottom end of the bell-shaped curve, the never in my lifetime people that, unfortunately, I guess we're waiting for them to pass on, I hate to say, but they will not change. So how do we incentivize change? Because climate crisis is here now. And if we do make these changes, we get all of those benefits of climate and the co-benefits we talked about. So what are some of those barriers to transition? And I want to give acknowledgement to two colleagues I worked with from Punjab University in India, where we were trying to work to get farmers to go no-till with their rice and to stop burning the rice straw. You know, India had, in that region in Punjab, a lot of auto accidents and deaths occurring during the very foggy times of the year and the monsoons when the rains hit, a lot of car accidents. They have 3 times of the year now. That is the foggy season, the monsoon season, and the rice straw burning season, where there's no visibility on the roads. But more importantly, that rice left black carbon on the glaciers in the Himalayas, which was rapidly melting those glaciers, which would destroy water supplies through Nepal all the way down into India. So we were trying to do that, and these university professors in Extension were students of adoption theory, and they strategized of how they could get one village to shift and how that happened, and then how you could move it to more villages. And I think we have to begin to think creatively. But let's just go through the mind of a farmer right now and say, you know, will I, as a farmer, change? Well, we have to first work up against a history and a practice that has been somewhat successful for them. And you're asking them to shift. And I can remember standing in my field in Africa on that poor soil that Howard Buffett had given me, and I'm thinking, how is this crop going to grow? I didn't bring in compost or even cow manure. I'm going to grow this crop and do some cover crops and rotate. And I so wanted to bring something in, but I said, no, let's learn how to do this. And I didn't have a financial risk. I didn't have to worry about my family eating for that, but what if you do? It's hard to change when you have something you know versus something that only presents a risk to you because you don't know it. Secondarily there is university training in lots of parts of the world where people have been trained in, as Adrian calls it, the geochemical model, which simply means the bringing the nutrients to a mineralized soil, because it's seen as a medium, not as a living system, as Elaine Ingham has explained to us today. And that training, I can say that my father, 30 years before me, in the 30s, took the same soil science class I took in the 60s. I swear, it didn't change. And so much of that remains similar. That science has refined itself in that geochemical paradigm, which is not dealing with this living system. So our training, both at a higher educational level or just that we inherited through practice from our relatives, remains barriers. The whole system approach of understanding soils is a new way of thinking, because we were sort of raised in reductionist thinking in everything we do. We're looking for simple, quick solutions, a Band-Aid, a fix of this. In the medical world, it's a pill, et cetera. And in non-whole systems thinking, we're not listening to the complexity of what Jeffrey was just talking about or what Elaine was talking about. Our body works in a whole system. The soil works as a whole system. So changing that understanding, and here's the kind of thing that I think that we haven't been observant enough or paid attention enough to Earth. This planet doesn't have any wastes until humans engaged it and started to change those equations. An example is we have methane gases rising in our atmosphere, and we can identify different sources of those. That's out of balance. Was methane produced before we dug oil up or before we grew rice in a paddy environment? Yeah, there was methane produced in natural systems. Well, how come they didn't increase or grow? You know, Dr. Christine Jones always likes to share the story with us that if you look at termite mounds, like in many parts of the world, that those big, tall dirt mounds that are made and the termites bury down and they're eating the organic matter, they're one of the greatest methane producers on this planet. But if you measure with a probe down in their hole, that's one of the lowest levels of methane you can find. And the reason is the bacteria that eat methane, the methanotropic bacteria, begin to reside in that termite hole. That's where their food source is. So the termites don't really emit to the world. They emit a lot, but it doesn't escape because Earth and nature has no waste. It's a great example for us to think about this system. One of the next barriers for our farmers is peer pressure. And I can tell you, farmers sometimes start to make changes, and maybe a few weeds show up in their field, and they go down to the coffee shop, and people start to poke fun at them. They go, look at that. Didn't you get your herbicide out today? And they adopt to what their community's kind of teaching us. We all find ourselves in that peer pressure approach. And it's something that we're going to have to create some sense of esteem around moving to this whole new, healthy living paradigm. Russell Hedrick, in North Carolina, was doing this regenerative. He started it in the last decade. And he would hold field days, and he would have people from a few countries and many states come to his field days because he was becoming so successful in his regeneration. But no farmers from his own county, his neighbors, didn't come. It was sort of like, you're different. You're a little odd. Gabe Brown, so successful in North Dakota, now selling premium products, agricultural products, high nutrient density products proven and tested. None of his neighbors have changed. Not looking over the fence. It wasn't until Russell was planting corn in that 4-inch rain season and he got 125 bushels did they all come to a field day because they were at real deep financial risk? So it's hard for us to admit that our methods are not actually the best or that I should actually make the change. So there's also programs that our governments put forward around the world that are often misinformed or misdirected, and sometimes they're actually supporting degrading practices. And that's something that we all need to be looking at with regard to how do we shift the policy so it supports this living system. And that, to me, is a big issue when we stand in this nation's capital, but other nations' capitals around the world, to begin to consider how do we support the regenerative systems, not the degenerative systems. The universities in and of themselves are a barrier because their PhDs have historically been trained in the geochemical model of input-based thinking, not living biomes. And we have, unfortunately for a lot of the PhDs, their rewards are based on publishing in the journals that reinforce that conversation among peers that have made their careers and their understanding and their science in those models. And we have to begin to help somehow and incentivize and bring resources into the regenerative living model. Dr. Cindy Daly at Chico State is our director for the center, and I don't work for the university, I consult and help. But it's a pleasure to work with Dr. Daly because of her holistic thinking and her ability to embrace and learn and then develop research. We now are in communication with 3 other universities in the country that want to start it, and we heard of 2 others. That's a small number. Problematically, is state and federal funds are not being directed this way. So we've had to operate in our own philanthropic efforts to find donors to kind of come along with us. And so far, we've been able not only to survive, but to so far thrive. This big research project we intend to do will take about $12 million, so we have a big task ahead of us to raise that fund, but we think it's the most crucial work that can be done on the planet today. I would say that field advisors are a barrier because there are so many consultants to farmers that help them with their issues that are trained in the old model. And the only method they know is the old model. And they don't know about insects not being able to eat healthy plants. They don't know about disease pressures being pushed back through a natural, healthy soil biome. They don't know there are 22 species of free associating nitrogen-fixing organisms that you don't need the fertilizers either. And they don't know how to feed those organisms through the plant roots. So we have to retrain them. And at Chico, Dr. Daly has one project that has some government funding that is going to work in all Northern California counties for a technical service provider training program. Could we have that across the country? Could we have that around the world? That would be extremely helpful to the farmers. One of the things that I would also say is, let's look at opportunities. So there's no incentive for the farmer to go this way too much yet, except if they really understand the profit and the health of their soil. But in essence, carbon markets are a reality today. Whether you agree with them or not, they live out there in the world. It's a business model of buying carbon credits. Agriculture could be a huge carbon market, but one of the concerns I think we should all have is if they are based on modeling, not based on outcomes. And the point here is that the modeling is based on the old geochemical science. We need to reward a Russell Hedrick or a Gabe Brown for that 10 tons of carbon per hectare per year. That's 10 times more the income they should receive because they've taken down that much more carbon. If we think about it as citizens and consumers, all of us are engaged in emitting carbon. Who's going to take care of our excesses for us? Well, farmers are a great avenue if they go in this regenerative model. There should be some transfer of payment to them to incentivize that shift, perhaps, if you believe in carbon markets. And that, to me, is a logical system. It would improve the farmer's well-being, but it would improve all the ecosystem services we talked about. We know companies can have a big effect, and they are a barrier. A few of them are helping to break those barriers, but just a very few. Some multinational companies that have been in touch with us have talked about their interest in regenerative agriculture. but we haven't seen their checks come to the table to really incentivize it or do the research or help it transition. They'd love to benefit from it, but we haven't seen them make that investment. There are a few companies who are living truly by their values. Many of those are B corporations, which you know also have not just profit, but also the environment and sociological issues of concern for them as well. And I'm working with one now with the CEO who definitely, I can tell you, is real. He is making his company make this work and investing in regenerative and helping to support and promote it, not just for his company, but for food companies he supplies. And that's the kind we want. We need to call out those companies that are greenwashing, that are using the term, but are they actually making this happen? And we need to be able to help them understand the benefits, not just to them, to the planet, and to the long-term existence of their business. I think that's a critical element for us to think about. It strikes me that, what about you and me as consumers? What's our role in regenerative agriculture? Do we have a role? And I would argue that, yes, we have a big role. It's the choices we make on the food we purchase, which means, first of all, if you have farmers markets, can you create a relationship with your producer of food, and in that relationship, question their methodologies for production, and begin to ask them if they understand this, and to give them sites like the Center for Regenerative Agriculture at Chico State or Elaine Ingham's Soil Food Web with regard to how they could learn more about building soil health and the biology. That's one way. Not all of us have those 12 months a year. This part of the world, a lot of farmers markets will get pretty small. But in essence, we can also have pressure on and choose where we're shopping for food and begin to ask. As a consumer, it used to be that you could walk into a grocery store and if 6 people asked for a certain product, it showed up on the shelf. So there's going to be some tracking, some verification issues, but ask, demand, require that your food become a regeneratively produced food. One of the things that I think is really important too is that we need more Dr. Elaine Inghams and Dr. Christine Jones from Australia and Dr. Chris Nichols here, as well as Dr. David Johnson, who we work with consistently from New Mexico State University, and people like Nicole Masters, who are these soil biologists that see the whole systems. We've got to begin to train them. And so in the university world, we have a demand, which is wonderful, of students that want into regenerative programs. There are really no basic undergraduate programs in the world that's specifically regenerative ag, except for one university in Australia, and that's Southern Cross University, that has created a curriculum. Dr. Daly is creating a curriculum, and we have 8 graduate students. We have probably 20 or 40 or 50 more graduate students would want in that we can't accommodate because of resources. We need other universities to take that on because we have to create the scientists for the future that know this work, that study this work, that research it, and help us all understand it better. We know in the world of farming, right now, there is such a demand for students to be trained in regenerative agriculture, and that's not yet happening from the undergraduate or the community college level to any degree. What an investment that would be to help transition our aging farming populations around the world that needs to happen. One of the things that I would say is that there are people that I have the privilege of working with that I know are working hard on this, like with the Carbon Underground and the Healthy Soil Biome Alliance that is really working to create an alliance of people paying attention. What Jeffrey mentioned here with the coalition that's being brought together. It strikes me that in sort of summarizing this is that when we think about our opportunity to restore Earth's life systems, another friend of mine is starting to print t-shirts, and I tell him now at this time of year I need a sweatshirt. But what he's printing on them is Mars is for quitters. And let's be sure and think about that one. Here is a living planet. We've been doing our best to kind of destroy that life, but we have a chance to restore it. And the other thing is Dr. David Johnson always says, why do this work? And he says, because there is no planet B. And I like those 2 summaries to think about, this is where we are. We now have enough information from what nature is revealing to us that we could restore, and we could make this actually happen. So I'm excited I'm not so hopeful, but I'm excited. And I get up every day for this work, for the purpose of helping educate and research and disseminate and create collaborations and help. And it's the reason I traveled across country burning up carbon dioxide and releasing it in the atmosphere to help this work become apparent in a broader world and hopefully create more interest and pressure. There are a few good books, if any of you are interested. Gabe Brown wrote a book called From Dirt to Soil and talks about farmers trying to help them understand this. I love Nicole Masters' book, For the Love of Soil. But one book that I want to mention because it's an important element of regenerative agriculture. And that is a colleague who had scheduled to come see me when I was in Africa, and then I'd come home for a couple of months. When he came, it was a disappointment, but I met him later and gotten to know him as Dr. David Johnson from University of Washington. And his book that I read twice, because I thought it was so crucial to really get deeply ingrained in me, is that his book was titled Dirt, the Erosion of Civilization. And in essence, what's important about this is that FAO reminds us that at our current rate of soil loss, soil degradation, in other words, not regeneration, we have about 55 years of topsoil left. So if the climate crisis here has us in the next 4, 5, 10 years, we've got to make changes now. The second existential crisis is running, that we're losing our soils in our farming practices. They're degrading, losing their fertility, they're washing away, they're blowing away because lack of aggregation, lack of soil cover, and lack of biology to make that system work. So it's an important element. I guess I was first introduced to regenerative agriculture in the 80s in Honduras because in fact, a man there by the name of Roland Bunch, who worked at that time for World Neighbors, it's now Groundswell International, in agroecological work, had shown me in Honduras, he said, look, we are growing soil an inch a year. And he said, there's not a textbook in the world that says that's even possible. And he was doing it through multi-species cover crops. Mucuna is particularly a huge biomass producer. The roots would break and demineralize up the bedrock. He would grow it in the midst of his corn and squash. It would take over at the end of the season. They would cut it all down, let that biomass return, feed the biology below, not do really much tillage, and now I think he understands no tillage. And what happens is the soil grew. Well, a few years later, a number of years later, I guess, I met Roland again. We stayed friends, but I met him in Zambia. I was speaking at a conference, and he was speaking at the first continent-wide conference for conservation agriculture. And he said to me, he said, Tim, he says, you know, when I told you we could build an inch of topsoil a year, he said, I wasn't telling you the truth. And I go, what? I've been telling people all over the world that's possible. And he goes, no, we were making much more, but I knew you wouldn't believe me. Well, that is one of the most encouraging things for us to reflect upon. We can restore the lost soils on this planet through this biological regenerative system. That is true regeneration. And that's the future and the hope that we have in this work. That's the support and the questions and the investigation, and we invite you into it to inquire, to encourage people to experiment, to encourage people to open their minds, to read, to challenge, and to learn more as we move forward. With that, it's been a delight to share our thoughts, our understandings, our research, our hope for the future with you today. Thank you for coming.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Liam Brown, and I'm here to represent the Pittsburgh Knights in solidarity and support of the Coalition for Regenerative Agriculture. Many people view gamers and esports fans alike as Red Bull chugging dopamine addicts who don't necessarily have an opinion regarding climate change, environmental protection, or politics as a whole. And I'm here to tell you that that's simply not true. At the Knights, we want to bring up these important environmental discussions in our own circles in order to better protect and safeguard the future of our planet by promoting regenerative agricultural products and principles to our global esports fan base. We want to thank the Coalition for Regenerative Agriculture for the opportunity to bring this movement to esports. And with that, I'd like to introduce our next guest. It's truly amazing to see how knowledgeable he is on regenerative agriculture in the European Union. And he actually was going over about it a whole bunch of times when we went out for drinks last night. So I'm very excited to see what he has to say. He's a trade professional, knowledgeable in all things Romania. Please welcome the Trade and Economic Counselor of Romania, Matei Balaita.
Thank you. Thanks much for making us part of this incredibly important conversation about reducing the carbon footprint of agriculture practices while getting more efficient and sustainable at the same time. I must say I'm humbled by the expertise in this room. As it becomes increasingly obvious that climate changes will wreak havoc on our economies if we don't act fast, I believe that we're also at a junction where we have an incredible opportunity to generate new incentive structures to spur economic growth and create new business ecosystems for the 21st century. The Romanian agriculture sector, much like all other members of the European Union, has benefited significantly and relied heavily on the funds from the EU's Common Agricultural Policy programs, or CAP programs. CAP payments have supported the modernization of the Romanian economy and involved more young people in farming and agriculture. The CAP subsidies have had a particularly prominent role in halting rural immigration and creating job opportunities in rural communities. However, this work is still hampered by some bottlenecks in the implementation of the policies. One such snag is related to the nature and structure of the Romanian agriculture sector. Most Romanian farms are small by American by all standards, the average size of about 25 acres, and scattered across a large number of villages, the countryside, poor levels of infrastructure. The second one is related to the low level of skill and education of the farmers. Even with the incentives from the first CAP right after Romania joined the EU in 2007, so we're talking about the interval 2007-2013, which contribute to the increase in the number of young farmers and the overall modernization of the agriculture sector, the overall level of technical and economic efficiency of the Romanian ag sector was significantly lower than in the Western Europe. The amount granted under the first CAP gradually increased in value from 2007 to 14, from 51 to about 156 euros per hectare. The second CAP, that's starting to 14, promoting the reduction of reliance on subsidies to gradually reduce and eventually end the support. And in the 2014-2020, the amount granted per hectare was much significantly lower than under the first CAP, from to about 80 to 100 euros per hectare. Over the past 4 years, it stabilized about 100, in the neighborhood of 100 euros, which is $120 per hectare. We are now at the onset of the third CAP, which is expected to put significant emphasis on combating climate change, sustainable agriculture, and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, the traditional subsidy programs financed under the first and the second CAP are expected to receive even less money, which creates, of course, an imperative of change and an opportunity for the Romanian ag sector. The strategic change at the European Union level towards supporting sustainable, environmentally friendly agriculture methods indicates that this will be a long-term trend. It provides an opportunity for Romanian agriculture to use the new CAP funds to overhaul its agriculture sector towards sustainable and renewable agriculture, reaping both economic and environmental benefits. The next EU Common Agriculture Policy for the 23-27 will favor and promote regenerative agriculture practices. The European Green Deal is a set of policy initiatives aimed at addressing the causes of climate change and mitigating its effects. And its primary goals are no net emissions of greenhouse gases by 2050, economic growth decoupled from resource use, and no person and place left behind. Supposedly, it will promote clean and renewable energy, environmentally friendly practices, and methods to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Implementation of these principles to ag policies is set out in the strategy from farm to fork strategy, which represents a long-term strategic document governing the future ag policies in the European Union. The strategy has the following goals: 25% EU agriculture organic by 2030, reduce 50% the use of pesticides by the year 2030, reduce the use of fertilizer by 20% by the year 2030, reduce nutrient loss by at least 50%, reduce the use of antimicrobials in agriculture and antimicrobials in aquaculture by 50% by 2030, create sustainable food labeling, and reduce food waste by 50% over the next 10 years. The policy aims to promote a sustainable, economic, competitive ag sector. Of course, agriculture represents a key part of the European Green Deal. And the new CAP will be a key mechanism to implement the policy objectives set out by the Green Deal, while providing further development of rural communities and effectual agricultural production. Its main objectives are, of course, to ensure a fair income to farmers, to increase competitiveness, to rebalance the power in the food chain, environmental care, climate change action, create vibrant rural areas, protect food and health quality. Last but not least, carbon farming programs may be the next game changer. The Commission announced in the Farm to Fork strategy that in 2021 it will launch a carbon farming initiative to promote a green business model that rewards climate-friendly practices by land managers based on the climate benefits they provide. In addition, as announced in the Circular Economy Action Plan, the Commission will develop a regulatory framework for certifying carbon removals based on robust and transparent carbon accounting to monitor and verify the authenticity of carbon removals. Carbon farming will provide financial incentives to the actors of the bioeconomy for climate-friendly activities, resulting in carbon removals and storage, thus creating a new source of income and helping them adapt their businesses to withstand the effect of the climate change. In April this year, after a two-year study, the EU Commission, published a technical handbook on how to set up and implement carbon farming in the EU, aimed at helping private actors and public authorities start up initiatives in the carbon. The study concluded that result-based carbon farming can contribute significantly to the EU's efforts to tackle climate change and provide concrete recommendations on its implementation. Pilot initiatives are going to be developed at the local or regional level to gather experience to upscale carbon farming. This will enable improving design aspects, in particular the certification of carbon removals and expanding farmers' knowledge and understanding the potential benefits of them. Carbon farming initiatives can be financed by the Common Agriculture Policy, other public funding instruments such as state aid and private initiatives linked to the carbon markets, or through a combination of all of these. Hopefully in the future, there will be a great integration between the EU and the US, this very particular issue, and hopefully it will spur the growth that we've been hoping for in the past 50 years. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Mate. I'm going to give the closing remarks, and I wanted to bring some new information that you haven't heard yet as well. We heard from Tim a few moments ago about the paradigm shift and what it takes for adoption theory. But I think he was being a little bit underselling what's actually happening here in terms of a level of enthusiasm. In the last three-year course that started, that Dr. Ingham was offering, there were 4,000 students. When her graduates start working with farms and farm communities, soon they go back to Dr. Ingham and say, we need more people. I talked to one regenerative agriculture farmer who's working in poultry, and he showed a picture of the two farms next to each other, and on the right side was a soybean farm, and the other one was his new operation, and he described the difference in income, $1,700 per acre on the right side, about $17,000 to $20,000 per acre on the left side. He had a long list of farmers ready to adopt when he finally got the investment, never needed to advertise. They were coming to him. Tim knows of a regenerative agriculture grain operation that does on-field milling, and the profit per acre went from $60 to $6,000, from $60 to $6,000 per acre. Now, that kind of excitement creates little communities of people ready to jump. But actually, it's not little communities. There's 70 countries already that have instituted that system that Tim's team is verifying, and many more countries lining up. There's representatives or organizations from over 170 countries that are part of the network of regenerative agriculture. So what we actually have now in the process of adoption is a window that is welcoming leadership, to take the energy, the new information, and to meet the urgent demand. And as Tim so brilliantly pointed out, there are many pressure points to bring that information to, but we understand it. We understand how the system is set and how we can bring this knowledge and make it easier to adopt, and which type of incentives and type of information and type of messaging that would make a leader in this space have a movement that can't be stopped. And that's actually what we need. The Coalition for Regenerative Agriculture, which is your host today, is bringing experts like Tim and Elaine and Adrian to Washington, to decision makers, so that they can understand the benefits. And we can support decision makers with additional resources. And when there are opportunities, when there are new bills, when there are initiatives to share with others, we have a footprint. Through our network of networks, we reach several million people, at least 22,000 retailers, several million throughout the world. And we have online mechanisms to take their enthusiasm, to direct it with support for particular initiatives to particular actors, so that we can demonstrate the enthusiasm that I speak of today. So we stand ready to work with those that want to step up to be leaders. And one of the great benefits of us coming to Washington, D.C. is in our brief experience here, it is absolutely clear that this is being treated as a nonpartisan issue, that this is being treated as something that everyone can get behind, to meet a need of the time, to meet an unmet need that people want to find a vision of success. They're looking for it. And so there's excitement among the leadership, cross aisle, across country, connections between the United States and Eastern Europe and in other places, that it's very exciting. So please contact us at the Coalition for Regenerative Agriculture.org, and we would like to work with you and see how we can support each other in establishing this vision and changing the world. Thank you very much.